We are recording now. Okay. So
Chris, since you're doing the first intro, would you be able to introduce us as a group before you start?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll just do, I'll say something like, okay, for today's argument, we're going to be discussing the use of punishment, and we're going to have two of our team members arguing against the use of punishment. That'll be myself and Courtney Andrews. And we'll also have two people discussing or arguing for the use of punishment, which will be Kayla Helms. Is that how you pronounce your last name?
Yeah.
Helms? Okay, perfect. And Ellen Lewis.
yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay, so
sounds good.
perfect. Okay, so I guess I'll start off. So we're going to start off by just talking about what is the goal of applied behavior analysis, and it is technically to increase socially significant behavior. So whenever we're talking about increasing behavior, we're talking about reinforcement. If there's one thing we know as behavior analysts, it's that reinforcement works. So one of the first screenshots that you'll see is a graph on reinforcement and what was the other? On reinforcement and punishment. Okay, so the graph that's on display currently, is there a way to get it? Are we still working on getting it up?
Do you know how to get it up on the screen for us?
Oh,
No.
sorry. I just have the visuals that I'm talking about.
So if you go to the left side of your screen on the video, there's that little green box with the arrow.
Okay.
And if you click that, we'll be able to see what you're seeing. But you won't be able to see the video anymore because you'll have your.
Oh, I see.
We'll be able to.
Okay. Got it. Okay. Well, I'll find. Okay, I'll have to find that and make sure it's ready to go. I'll come back to that in a second. Okay. Cool. So during our time together, Courtney and I will address considerations within the ethics code and applied behavior analysis and how they apply to the right for effective treatment. We will also discuss the importance of the role of functional behavior analysis when examining behaviors. We'll also address the importance of preference assessments and why we need to be sure the reinforcers themselves are actually effective. One of the biggest issues that we see with punishment is that there's still a gap in the literature about the lasting effects of punishment. Lastly, our time together will be spent reflecting on the history of punishment with some basic discussion of its clinical use and how it relates to the Individuals with Disabilities Act, also known as IDEA.
All right, so that was a good intro, and now I want to add more of a summary of what we'll be talking about in my intro. Yes. But this is what I currently have. So I'll be discussing some of our views of pro-punishment procedures. Some people think that punishment is a negative thing with the purpose of harming a child, but this isn't the case. According to Meadows, 2011, punishment is when a response is followed immediately by a stimulus change that decreases the future frequency of similar responses. This basically means that something is done to reduce a particular behavior. For example, if a child hits his sister while they are swinging together, he must go to his room for 3 minutes, and this leads to him hitting his sister less. This would be an example of negative punishment because something is being taken away, the swing. The other type of punishment is positive punishment, where something is added. Punishment can bring about immediate change in behavior, according to Meadows 2011. So it is a useful technique in behavior change. Nonetheless, punishment procedures are taken very seriously and are avoided when possible. Individuals in the field of ABA are ethically required to utilize punishment interventions only after careful consideration, and consent from the parent or child is required. Also, punishment is typically only used after reinforcement-based options have proven ineffective. And reinforcement of good behavior is often used alongside punishment of maladaptive behavior. According to DeGennaro, Reed, and Lovett, 2008, nearly all of the members of the Association for Behavior Analysts who were surveyed think that punishment should be reserved for behaviors that pose a danger to the individual or others. The majority of these members also think that many supposedly non-aversive procedures actually have components that rely on aversive control. And I'm going to bring up a visual of the charts for this survey. So here you can see the table where it talks about how punishment should be reserved for behaviors that pose a danger to the individual or others. The mean response here was 4.9, in agreement with 5 being the highest. And there's also a table talking about non-aversive procedures. Where am I at here? That many non-aversive procedures actually have components that rely on aversive control. The majority, sorry guys, behavior analysts are required to follow ethical codes and guidelines that keep the client safe from harm and ensure that they're in the least restrictive environment. So any punishment procedures are well thought out and are closely monitored, and the child's best interests are taken into account each step of the way. Punishment-based procedures can be safe and effective if these guidelines are followed, and they have proven to be an effective way to reduce a number of behaviors. So now we'll move into some of the research we found on punishment procedures.
Okay, so I'll start by talking about punishment being the last resort. According to Ethics Code 4.08, behavior analysts should recommend reinforcement rather than punishment whenever possible. Due to the fact that punishment can produce negative side effects, other strategies should almost always be used first. The only event in which punishment should be used first would be in a very rare circumstance where the individual could be in a life-threatening situation due to their problem behavior. According to Section C of this code, before a behavior analyst implements a punishment-based procedure, they need to ensure that the correct steps have been taken to implement reinforcement-based procedures first, and only implement aversive procedures if the problem behavior is severe and it needs immediate action. Even in these situations, before implementing aversive procedures, the behavior analyst should consider any biological or medical factors that could be causing the problem behaviors. If an analyst is going to use a punishment procedure, Section D of this code requires that this individual has had training and supervision on this procedure and must consistently evaluate the effectiveness and immediately discontinue the use of this procedure if it produces any negative side effects or is showing to be ineffective.
The next point we're going to talk about is an article that was written by Lerman and Vorndren that where they discussed the usefulness of functional behavior analysis. In this article, that they have seen many positive results on the numerous studies that were conducted over past 15 years within functional analysis. Each author found that through this process, the function of problem behavior can be determined, and with this information, the development of treatment based on extinction, reinforcement, and other behavior analytic techniques such as DROs, DRAs, and DRIs. Once a behavior is chosen to be targeted and a positive behavior plan is developed, the next important step is determining reinforcement. It is true that industry standards tell us that the use of punishment is a last case resort. However, one thing that should be especially considered within applied behavior analysis before stating that reinforcement doesn't work is determining the effectiveness of the reinforcer that was previously being used. Many times when reinforcement is not seen as effective, it is because the reinforcer that was chosen is not truly reinforcing. In behavioral terms, a reinforcer increases the likelihood of a behavior happening. So if the targeted behavior is not increasing, we need to consider things such as, is the individual satiated on the chosen reinforcer? And was there a proper reinforcement preference assessment conducted? Or when was the last time a preference assessment was conducted? By addressing these questions, punishment can be avoided.
Okay, we did have a quick a question about that, because there are, as we know, some extreme cases that will pop up for things such as aggression or self-injury behavior, self-injurious behavior. I know you're saying that punishment should be used as a last resort. Would these be the kind of behaviors where you think punishment would be acceptable, where there is harm to others or the client themselves?
Yes, in the same article where they did discuss functional behavior assessments and analysis, they also discussed very dangerous behaviors, and they also discussed the usefulness of response blocking and positive practice, which can also be effective for those more dangerous and serious behaviors.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for sharing, Chris. The next thing I'd like to discuss is how punishment can lead to more immediate change. So sometimes punishment might have faster change than reinforcement or other interventions. It can also be beneficial for those extreme behaviors that we discussed, like self-injurious behavior that need fast results to keep everyone safe.
And even for behaviors that aren't extreme, we found several articles that actually showed that the use of punishment not only it increased how fast the students learned what they're learning, and we're not talking about like an extreme form of punishment. The type of punishment used was what we call response costs. So, for example, if you were targeting behavior such as aggression or hitting, say a client is earning their tokens to earn their reinforcement, they hit, you take a token away. So, like, it's not like corporal punishment, like hitting the child or adding an aversive stimulus. This is more of a use of negative punishment. So you're removing a positive thing, you're removing a preferred item from the environment, taking that token away so that there is a consequence or response cost. And that is the type of punishment they used. And they found that helped their students learn faster, learn their goals faster. And this kind of leads us to our ethical code 2.9, which is about treatment and intervention efficacy. And this states that clients have a right to effective treatment, which is based on the research and literature and adapted to the individual client. Behavior analysts always have an obligation to advocate for and educate the client about scientifically supported and most effective treatments, which would tie into the quickness of the learning with even just a minor punishment, like a simple response cost. Effective treatment procedures have been validated as having both long-term and short-term benefits to the clients and society. This is again referencing the code 2.9. And so it does go on, but mostly it is talking about, providing the most effective treatment for your client, and in some cases that may involve punishment. In the research article discussed by Brackbill, we have a little picture for you to see, which shows the rates of learning. Give me one moment here. Okay, and in this study, sorry, I'm trying to figure out which one it is. I think it's, okay, so in this table here, you can see they had two groups. They had one where they received only reinforcement, and one group, so they were only received reinforcement for when a correct response was given, and the other group was punished for giving in the form of response cost for incorrect response, and then as well as reinforced for giving a correct response. And here you can see this group here never reinforced. They oh, this was the first criterion. So this only reinforcement, it took them on average 70 trials to meet criteria, whereas the reinforced and punished group got to about 30, had an average of 32 trials to get to a correct response. And same even on the second criteria, to get to 10 consecutive correct responses. You can see that the reinforcement only group had 98 on average. It took them 98 trials, whereas the reinforcement and punishment group took them 64 trials.
Perfect. Couple questions. How do you apply a systematic way to fade the punishment? And what happens if the behaviors still do not increase after punishment is being used?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. Definitely punishment. You shouldn't use punishment randomly. It should definitely be laid out for a specific behavior, and which would require a specific response. So for example, you wouldn't just say like, anytime they aggress, then they lose a token. You would specifically say like, when the child hits with an open hand, like hits the instructor, then they lose their token. Or you could say anytime they hit their peer, teacher, or any other adult, they lose the token with an open hand. So it has to be you definitely want to lay out the criteria very specifically for what would require the punishment procedure, and then what exactly the punishment procedure is, so that it's not up to the discretion of the person implementing that intervention. As far as if the procedure is not working, if the punishment procedure is not having an effect on the behavior, you definitely want to check the fidelity of the intervention, make sure everyone's implementing it correctly, and of course reevaluate if that's not being effective, as we would if the reinforcement wasn't being effective.
Great.
Oh, this brings me back into another point about fading punishment. Obviously, punishment shouldn't be like our go-to for everything. We don't think that. However, it does seem to be effective. That doesn't mean we want to use it all the time. Ideally, we don't have to punish people to receive the behavior that we're looking for. So in one article from Lazzolire, they really worked on how they can fade their punishment. And they found that they were looking at parents who used simply reasoning to combat their child's what's it called? Their child's disruptive behavior versus using reasoning paired with punishment. So again, this is another article comparing two different sides. So just the reasoning, or is it more effective with the reasoning and punishment? And they found that it was effective for parents to use reasoning alone. However, it was much more effective if punishment had also been used. And this continued to be the case if punishment had been used in the past. So for parents who are using reasoning alone, this was more effective if that reasoning had been paired with punishment in the past versus parents who had only ever used reasoning. So that kind of showed that the effect of the punishment was still effective, still had an impact on their behavior even after it had been faded and had been removed from their intervention plan.
And how much training did these parents undergo before using punishment?
It was, forgot to look up the answer to that. I believe it wasn't much. I'm gonna have to insert that answer later.
Sure, no problem.
Put a little star by that.
Okay. Well, this will actually piggyback into a conversation that I want to have about the lack of research about certain areas in punishment and why we should know as much as we can about the effects of an intervention before implementing it. This specifically addresses Ethics Code 2.08. In an article, Capaldi et al., they did some important research where results showed that prior experience with the punishing stimulus, either contingency or non-contingency, can decrease a behavior's sensitivity to punishment. For example, research findings with rats indicate that exposure to intermittent punishment with shock decreases the efficiency of continuous punishment with shock, even when several days of weeks lapse between intermittent and continuous punishment. Exposure to intermittent schedules of reinforcement and punishment is typical in the natural environment. Consequences often are delivered on intermittent schedules because it is difficult for parents and teachers to reinforce or punish every occurrence of a behavior. Basic findings indicate that a history with intermittent punishment may complicate treatment success in these cases, such that more intense punishers will be required to suppress behavior efficiency. Another area in which we are lacking knowledge of research is on basic and applied studies on punishment, where the long-term effects of maintenance, generalization, and side effects of punishment are evaluated. This is extremely important because the extent to which punishment effects are maintained over time transfer across settings and contexts and produce changes in other behavior that has significant implications for treatments involving punishment.
Okay, and then I will continue to discuss different areas that the authors identified that need more research in regards to punishment. So, some of the areas that were discussed in the article on the status of knowledge for using punishment implications for treating behavior disorders are the different factors that may influence the effects of punishment on problem behavior, identifying ways to enhance the effectiveness of less intrusive punishment procedures, how to reduce undesirable aspects of punishment, and how to successfully fade treatment that is using punishment. Other areas that would also be beneficial to continue researching are ways to improve the efficacy of punishment rather than doing more comparative studies of reinforcement versus punishment, the effectiveness of conditioned punishers, and the efficacy of pairing different types of stimuli with more common socially acceptable forms of punishment, the effects of reinforcement schedule or density on the outcome of treatment with punishment, and the parameters under which a reinforcement schedule is and is not an important factor when treating problem behavior with punishment.
Something that I think is important for parents and teachers and other professionals to realize is that punishment is rarely used in isolation. Instead, it's typically used in addition to other interventions, which increases the effectiveness of the punishment procedure. Many of the articles we looked at paired punishment with reinforcement, and a lot of times applied behavior analysis will put maladaptive behaviors on extinction, which is a form of punishment, while reinforcing appropriate behavior. Fisher and Maglieri, 2005, evaluated the use of functional communication training, or FCT, with and without a punishment component. The problem behaviors for one child were self-injury, aggression, and disruption. The other child exhibited some aggression. The children were taught to request attention by holding up a card that said play, or by saying attention please, or excuse me, for the functional communication training portion. The therapist then delivered 20 seconds of attention through verbal praise and interactive play, and problem behaviors were put on extinction with no differential consequence occurring. When the punishment component was added, each instance of problem behavior resulted in a 30-second hands-down procedure for one child, where the therapist stood behind him and held his hands to his sides. And there was a 30-second hands down and a visual screen procedure for the other child, in which the therapist stood behind her, placed one arm around the child's arms while placing the other hand over the child's eyes. Functional communication training plus punishment was more effective in reducing problem behavior, as you can see from this graph. Additionally, the children preferred the functional communication training that included punishment, which is shown in this graph. They pressed switches to choose what kind of intervention they wanted, and the functional communication training with punishment was pressed most frequently.
Okay. And were you done, Kayla?
Yes, I think
Okay,
so.
just wondering.
Yes, I'm done. Trying to
Okay.
get organized after that screen share, but you're good to go.
I will now talk about potential effects of punishment. When using punishment procedures, there is a chance that it can cause some negative side effects. Some of these negative side effects are an increase in aggression that can be towards the person implementing the punishment, negative emotional reactions, escape and avoidance responding. The individual may start avoiding both the setting they were punished in and the individual who implemented the punishment procedure. Another negative side effect could be the individual who is presenting the punishment can become paired with the punishment. That will make the client not want to be around the person because their presence can now be aversive to the client. Using punishment procedures also allows for the opportunity for the person who is implementing the procedure to misuse it by either making a mistake by punishing the wrong behavior or by deciding to implement the procedure on another client without seeking permission first.
To piggyback on to what Courtney's saying, I want to take a look through or reflect on some of the history of punishment. Rice and Kohler wrote an article that takes us back into history and reflects on the use of punishment from the very first psychiatric hospital in 1247. They discuss how punishment procedures that were used, such as being chained to the walls, whippings, and dunking in water. And they also discuss with us shock treatment. And this is just one example of our history with the use of punishment and how, by today's standards, this is seen as cruel and unusual. Other aversive interventions that were used were the treatments for what was considered sexual deviance, such as the LGBT community, and it included injected chemicals, electric shock, and unpleasant smells, and social shaming situations. Today, we've redefined what we consider to be deviant in the procedures in which we use to help people. We guarantee, what guarantee do we have that these punishment procedures we have today are no worse, will not be considered cruel down the line? According to Lorman and O'Rourke, despite this physiological shift in increasing empirical supportive for positive-based practices, students with disabilities continue to be at risk for exposure to aversive interventions. One piece of legislation put into place in recent years is IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, where students have the due process rights, which include educational programming and placement. We'll go further in detail about IDEA and how it serves these students a little later on in our argument.
Sorry, just a quick time out for a second. I wanted to switch around one of my points because I feel like it ties very well back into that.
Sure.
So I'm going to do the next summary, not the next one, but the following one, talking about close monitoring next. I think would flow better.
Sure.
That makes sense. Okay.
Okay. And I think it's just my part for both of them, so no one else should be affected, if that's okay. Okay, so Chris, you brought up an excellent point about our unfortunate history with punishment and how it has been used inappropriately in the past, which is definitely should always be on people's minds and should always be considered. However, we do, like we had mentioned previously, punishment when used should be, first of all, needs to be discussed with everyone involved, the parents, who's ever implementing the treatment, and anyone involved with implementing the punishment needs to be involved in working through that procedure as well as approving it. Like, this punishment should never be used without without approval or consent. And it also should be very closely monitored. We do have an unfortunate history of that drift, or like starting with a minor punishment, and then it just increases a little bit until we look at it now and we're like, I cannot believe that happened. So hope the idea is that with strict implementation guidelines, as well as very clear directions on when it should be used and when it should not be, that will help to that should prevent those sorts of instances, as well as close monitoring. In several of the studies we were looking at, especially in the Lazalira article, where they observed parents using punishment in punishment paired with reasoning, those families had they had cameras installed in their homes, so they were being watched. And so that's definitely something to take into account when looking at the results of these punishments, the punishing effects, as well as the type of punishments that were used. So having that close monitoring, checking up on the progress should prevent those occurrences from happening again. And then making that clear guideline for when it should be used, to make sure that it's not a judgment call for when punishment is used and when it's not. It's used for this instance and nothing else. That's what we hope to do with punishment, how it should be implemented. Along with that, I did want to go into the lasting effects of punishment. Again, in the Lazalira article, it was also a longitudinal study. So 20 months later, they found that using punishment resulted in more lasting effects than, again, just reasoning alone. And that was even after the punishment had been faded. And I do have a visual of this, which I think I'll actually get up this time. Let's see. There we go. So here we have the behaviors that they were targeting. They were targeting fighting and disobedience with the families. And the enforcers here are the ones that used punishment, and the natters, is what they called them, were the ones that used reasoning alone. And you can see they're measuring how long it took between each instance of fighting or disobedience. So pretty consistently with the enforcers, there was a longer delay between the reoccurrence of the behavior. And that's what I have.
Okay, and I have some questions for you.
Absolutely.
So, how many studies have yielded the same result, and is there a way to measure emotional responses?
Okay, definitely. We unfortunately didn't find any other studies that had the resources to do a longitudinal study. So we don't have that information, unfortunately. Those can be kind of tough to measure since they take so long. And the studies that we found, with I believe the exception of Kayla's article that she had mentioned earlier, where the subjects chose the punishment paired with the reinforcer procedure over just their other intervention. This particular study did not measure any emotional responses.
Okay. Oh, that's me. Okay, so I want to go back to discussing IDEA. And right now, there are provisions in the individual education plan that addresses the area of behavior intervention. But in states that allow corporal punishment, students are still at risk. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 protects students from discrimination because of their disabilities, but offers little protection when students are the recipients of corporal punishment. There was a case in Alabama where a 9th grader with a hearing had a hearing impairment. He turned around in his desk to assist a classmate. When he did not hear and thus comply with the teacher's instruction to face toward the teacher headbutted him. The federal trial court in Alabama dismissed the claim in light of available civil and criminal remedies in the host state. The court concluded that the plaintiff's parents had failed to allege facts that sufficiently supported a charge that the teacher's decision to headbutt the student was based on his disability. In the article, The Case Law on Aversive Interventions for Students with Disabilities, Lorman, O'Rourke, and Zirkle discussed numerous cases where parents filed suit where they believed aversive interventions were administered in such a way that their child's due process rights had been violated. Cases varied from a teacher using hot sauce to curb pica to the spanking of a student with a social emotional disorder. Parents received a favorable ruling in only 35% of the cases documented in the article. What if the dangers the authors Rice and Kohler see in using aversive interventions with individuals with developmental disabilities is their understanding of what is happening to them? In one case, a girl had an IQ of 50. She was terrified of the bathrooms. The author poses the question, did she understand that her teacher wanted her to clean up the mess, or did she draw the conclusion that her teacher was placing her in danger?
And then I will talk about positive behavior support versus punishment and the BCBA ethical code. In the article, Aversive Intervention Research and Reflection, it was stated that the Council for Exceptional Children, the American Association on Mental Retardation, and the Association for Persons with Severe Handicaps all supported less intrusive methods of intervention, asserting their effectiveness without negative side effects. When looking at positive behavior support versus punishment, one of the main advantages is of the positive behavior support is that through the use of the functional behavior analysis, the function of the behavior is determined and an appropriate behavior that serves the same function will be reinforced. This will decrease the use of the problem behavior and increase the more appropriate behavior without causing any negative side effects, and the individual will still be able to access whatever reinforcer they were looking for by engaging in the problem behavior. When using punishment, the individual is merely being taught what not to do, and they are not being taught more appropriate replacement behaviors. If positive behaviors want to be taught, some form of reinforcement will need to be used. Using positive behavior supports is also in compliance with Ethical Code 4.09, which states, behavior analysis, review and appraise the restrictiveness of procedures and always recommend the least restrictive procedures likely to be effective. This code directs analysts to follow 3 steps. 1, to use the least restrictive methods. 2, they do not interfere with the client's ability to contact reinforcement. And 3, to provide the client freedom of choice. If punishment is being used, the analyst will need to go over this code and ensure that they will not be violating any part of it.
And Courtney, I think it's a great point that you bring up, and I agree that on almost all of the studies that we looked at, punishment was used along with reinforcing the appropriate replacement behavior. But yeah, that definitely needs to be part of an intervention and be included in that. I think it's also to discuss the different levels of punishment. Definitely, we've mentioned in this presentation, in this debate here, many very different levels of punishment, from extinction and response costs to electric shock and other very aversive introductions of things. And so I think there are different levels of punishment, and when using punishment, you need to consider what level of punishment is necessary and use the lowest amount necessary. In the Lazzaleri article, they, along with having the punishment category as well as the non-punishment category, even within that punishment category, they excluded some things that were deemed to be harmful, that could be possibly harmful. So if the parent, they had a list of things that were acceptable to use as punishment, such as timeout, taking away privileges, extinction, spanking, and hand slapping. Anything that wasn't listed in those was not counted towards that punishment category, because that's too much. That's more than what we're looking for, and could be considered potentially harmful to the student. So it's definitely important to consider those things and take into, of course, we always need to take into consideration the well-being of our clients and make sure we're not violating their rights.
Now that we've discussed some of the punishment and some of the pros and cons of punishment, I wanted to give a few examples where punishment was implemented. Both positive and negative punishment have been utilized to decrease problem behaviors, and both methods have proven effective. Positive punishment occurs when something is added. An example of this would be using overcorrection, which is where the individuals would repeatedly need to do an action, such as cleaning up the floor, or engaging in a problem behavior, like throwing a piece of paper on the floor. When negative punishment is used, something is taken away. An example of this is removing a reinforcement, such as blocks, when a problem behavior like throwing the blocks is exhibited. The researchers Ringdahl and Falcomata, 2009, provided several examples that highlight the effectiveness of utilizing punishment procedures to decrease some maladaptive behavior. First, I want to go over some positive punishment interventions. In one study, individuals with severe SIB that were causing tissue damage with a risk of death were given an electric shock after occurrences of this severe SIB, and each of the participants immediately showed a decrease in severe SIB. At follow-up, it was discovered that no habituation had occurred for 4 of the 5 participants. In another example, positive punishment such as exercise and touching toes was utilized to reduce SIB in a teenage girl. Non-contingent reinforcement and a restraint fading program were also utilized to aid in decreasing this particular behavior. There was an immediate reduction in SIB when the punisher of exercise was in place. Next, I want to highlight some of Ringdahl and Falcomata 2009's examples of effective negative punishment. Response cost was utilized for children in a classroom setting in one example. When a child engaged in disruptive behavior, they lost a form of a star by that child's name. If they had any tokens left at the end of each setting, they were allowed to trade them for preferred items. This was found to be more effective than a DRO procedure. In a different study, reinforcement-based procedures were ineffective in reducing thumb sucking and hair pulling to a sufficiently low level, so researchers utilized response cost. The participant earned an M&M at specific time intervals for engaging in behaviors other than thumb sucking and hair pulling, and she lost 1 M&M for engaging in either of these behaviors. There was an immediate reduction in thumb sucking and hair pulling following the implementation of this intervention. Time out from reinforcement is another form of negative punishment. It was utilized to reduce elopement that was maintained by adult attention in one case. Adult attention was provided every 15 seconds, but if the child engaged in elopement, she was removed from the activity for 30 seconds and this attention was withheld. This resulted in a decrease in elopement to near 0 levels. I have one other example of the effectiveness of punishment. In this case, timeout from reinforcement was utilized to reduce the inappropriate vocalizations exhibited by an individual. The researchers identified a highly preferred activity, and access to this reinforcer was interrupted for a specified time after inappropriate vocalizations were omitted. This intervention resulted in an almost immediate reduction in the target behavior. Those are a few examples of effective punishment procedures.
Okay. And then to end our debate, I have some common questions about punishment. So the first one is, how might misunderstandings of the meaning of the word punishment in lay language as compared to behavior analytic terminology bias individuals on the use of punishment procedures and whether or not they are considered ethical?
That's a great question that I'd like to address. Since we're all in the field of ABA, we understand, which has come up a couple times in this article or in this debate, that when you're speaking in behavioral terms, reinforcement increases behavior while punishment decreases behavior. So while there are some layman terms of punishment that, you know, people outside of the field kind of visualize in their head of what they perceive to be punishment, such as a suspension from school, we know as behavior analysts that a suspension, even though socially it's considered a punisher, may not actually act as a punisher for students. In fact, it may increase their likelihood of engaging in the behavior if the function of their behavior is to escape. So it's very important when addressing others outside of the field to be very clear about what punishment is and why we're using it and what it means in behavioral terms.
Okay, and then the next question is, how might this misunderstanding influence staff or parent guardian willingness to implement a procedure?
This is definitely a concern, especially if they don't know what punishment truly means. Parents are likely to take their previous conceptions of punishment, such as suspension, into consideration when punishment is brought up as a treatment option. They're likely to fear for the safety of their child if they are only seeing punishment as something negative, and they would then feel leery about consenting to any of these punishment-based procedures. Even after defining punishment, describing the procedure in detail, it can be difficult to change someone's perspective about a topic. I think these same procedures would be better received if they were called something other than punishment that didn't have so many negative connotations associated with it. But hopefully with increased education and awareness of what punishment is, we would be able to help remedy this.
Okay, and our last question is, what are some suggestions to address that misconception?
Well, as Caleb mentioned, definitely explaining to most likely the parents or the guardians of our clients what we mean by punishment, or simply avoiding that term altogether and more addressing what we would like to do, as opposed to saying, hey, we want to punish your child. That's probably not going to go over well. Instead, you can say, like, you know, we've noticed your child has been hitting, then that behavior is increasing. We would like to do X, Y, and Z. Like, we would like to take away a token when she hits people. What do you think about that? Getting their input, understanding what they would be comfortable with and what they're not. So if they're like, you know what, I think that would not be a good idea, then you can think of another procedure. But definitely the term punishment can raise a lot of red flags for people. So educating on what we mean by that term, like, we're trying to reduce this. Doesn't mean we're going to hit your child. That doesn't mean we are specifically going to do these things to try and reduce this behavior. Would hopefully address that misconception. So yeah, thank you all for watching our debate, and we hope you enjoyed it and were informed. Thank you.